Hi, welcome everyone, and happy Census Day. Thank you for joining us for our talk on how to achieve a full census count amidst a pandemic. I'm Teresa Acuña, Associate Director of Democratic Governance Programs at the Ash Center. The Ash Center is one of 12 think tanks at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we focus on bridging academia and practice to improve our democracy. I want to start us off with some housekeeping announcements. First, I want to thank you in advance for your patience as we manage our conversation online. The virtual format is new to us. To minimize interruptions, the audience is muted, but we encourage your participation in the chat box where you can post questions or comments. We will dedicate the last about 25 to 30 minutes of our time together to answer questions from the audience. Again, feel free to use the chat box to send them. And lastly, this event is being recorded and could be found on the Ash Center website and the Harvard Votes Challenge website for future viewing. The census is a vital but often overlooked civic action in our democracy. Mandated in the Constitution, the census helps determine apportionment through the number of seats each state receives in the House of Representatives. The data is also used for redistricting and helps inform the distribution of approximately $1.5 trillion in spending on vital services such as hospitals, schools, and transportation. And while elections happen more frequently, the census only happens once every 10 years. And an undercount of a community risks their equitable representation in the halls of power and causes them to forego services available from the government and private sector. So we should not underestimate the importance of a full and accurate count in the census, and we have one shot to get it right. Helping us understand the census and the work that remains to achieve a full count are census experts leading national and state strategy. Joining us is Beth Flink from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Beth, can you give us a wave?
Hi, everybody.
Next is Ajay Saini from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. Ajay, can you give us a wave?
Hey, everyone.
Welcome. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Tran from the California Endowment.
Hi, folks.
Welcome. Thank you again for joining us. I thought we would have our conversation in two parts, kind of. The first part talking about the work that has been made leading up to this point. And I think that then we'll dedicate the next half to talk about what this particular moment and the crisis around the pandemic means to the census. So we'll start from kind of the beginning. And this is to everyone. To help our viewers gain a better understanding of the work you are engaged in, could each of the panelists start by sharing what their respective organizations are doing around the census? Starting with you, Beth.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having us. Happy Census Day, everybody. As we all know, the Census Day is an important marker where folks are counted as close to April 1 or on April 1, where you are as possible. We'll talk a little bit more about why this year is slightly different in a little bit, but this is a really important marker day. And we know all across the country and within our coalition, there are digital events happening online, conversations happening about why the census is important, its critical role when it comes down to distributing federal resources, state and federal political power. And from my perspective, coming from a civil rights organization and bringing together national organizations and state-based organizations to support census participation, we're also looking at the critical role that census data play in ensuring the enforcement of civil rights law as well, and the work that data plays in the long term over the decade. I think it's critically important for communities to know that, we get one shot at this for the next 10 years. And in a moment like this, when a lot of things are uncertain, know that most folks can still go online, fill out the census form by phone, or return that paper questionnaire while you're self-isolating or social distancing. The Census Counts campaign, which is housed at the Leadership Conference, is a collaborative effort among national organizations, state-based partners in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, as well as other key stakeholders like state and local elected officials and city officials who are working to ensure that those who are most at risk of being missed in the census participate. The Leadership Conference has been working on census outreach and work for decades, and our task force does a lot of policy work around the census in the intervening decades. But right now, we're all about ensuring that those communities that are most at risk of being missed participate in the census, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that kind of outreach looks like.
Great, thank you. Ajay?
Yeah, and thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work of Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the organization that I work for. We have been engaged on issues relating to the census for several years now. We are a nonprofit legal organization that works on civil rights issues generally. And with respect to the census, we have been engaged in litigation around several different issues relating to the census. So for instance, Lawyers Committee handled part of the litigation in California on the citizenship question. We have been engaged in working to defend actually the federal government against a challenge from the state of Alabama in the basically the state of Alabama is arguing that the federal government shouldn't be including undocumented persons in the apportionment count, and we have been defending the federal government on that. And we're also looking at other different ways that we can help ensure that there is a full and accurate count here. And to that end, we are also engaged in general census protection efforts, and we are operating a hotline for respondents who have any questions relating to the census. We're not the only group doing that. There are several other groups, NALEO, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and the Arab American Institute that are also operating hotlines. I won't just spat off the numbers for those. I can provide those to Teresa after, and we can circulate those numbers for anyone who's interested. But really happy to be here talking to you all on Census Day. And talking about how we can all work together to ensure that there's a full and accurate count.
Thank you, Ajay. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, folks. My name is Jonathan Tran. I'm a senior program manager with the California Endowment. We're a statewide health foundation that focuses on health equity and making sure that all Californians have access to health. We identified the census as something that was going to be critical to health equity pretty early on, and is going to be core as part of our work in terms of expanding racial and health equity across the state. So as a foundation, one of our priorities heading into the census about 2 years ago was our $17 million investment into the field in California to make sure that organizations all across the state were up and ready to go to make sure that we're reaching the hardest to count populations in California. It's like the best of times and worst of times in California. We have the hardest to count populations of any other state in the country. Simultaneously, the best of times is that we have a really supportive state government and kind of a strong network of nonprofit organizations that have been working on census. And so the bulk of our work around census is one, supporting the folks in the field that are originally doing the door-to-door efforts to mobilize hard to reach populations, and then also doing a layer of communications and coordination with the state as well as with partner organizations, focus on doing census education, but then also testing out tools to help reach unique populations, including immigrant communities, farm workers, more recently arrived immigrant communities, and trying to hit the spectrum of the folks that may fall through the cracks, both from the state and federal government level. So that's kind of been the focus, but excited to get into the conversation.
Great, thank you. And I'll follow up in a little bit. I want to dig in a little bit deeper about the role that state and local governments are playing in the census, as well as hard to count communities. to follow up, Beth, can you tell us a little bit more about the census itself? What can respondents expect to find on the 2020 census, and in what ways is this year's census different or the same from the last decennial census?
Yeah, absolutely. So the census is essentially a 10-question questionnaire that folks will be asked to participate. Important to know that every single person in the United States is invited to participate in the census. That's regardless of citizenship status, regardless of income, regardless of race. Everyone participates in the census. Everyone counts. The census form for the first time this year, a lot of folks are going to be participating in the census online. In fact, millions of folks already have participated and filled out their census form online, and that is a one thing that's definitely new this year, and makes it a little bit more accessible for some. And so definitely that is at 2020census.gov. You can also participate in the census by phone. There is you're able to respond in English that way, as well as 12 other languages, or by returning a paper questionnaire that some households may have gotten in your first mailer, but all households will get by their fourth mailer, which will come the second week of April. So if you really want to fill it out by paper, just hang tight, you'll get a paper questionnaire. Couple things to know about what's on that form. So again, it's 10 questions. It'll ask you questions about kind of who you are, how you identify, so race and origin, ethnic origin. It will ask about the folks in your household. So if you are, and your relationship to them. For the first time on this 2020 census, it asks, and it allows you to identify same-sex partners that you're living with. So that was definitely a hard-fought victory for advocates looking to get that added to the question, or that question added to the questionnaire. And other essential questions like that. A couple things that the census will not ask you. It will not ask your citizenship status. It will not ask for your social security number. It will not ask you for any payment information. Important that we get that information out far and wide. That none of that is on the 2020 census. We know, again, that there is no citizenship question on the 2020 census, and that was a result of a lot of really hard work from smart litigators and advocates fighting really hard to ensure that that was not added to the form. Oh, Teresa, you might be muted.
There we go. Well, that's a great segue to our next question to Ajay. One of the controversial proposed changes to the census was the Trump administration's attempt to add a citizenship question. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the citizenship question meant to achieving a full count and the litigation that ensued? And what was the outcome of the litigation, and what kind of chilling effect may it have on participation?
Sure. So the Trump administration first began thinking about and actually moving towards adding a citizenship question at the end of 2017 into about March 2018. March 2018 was when the decision was announced. And immediately after it was announced, there were several lawsuits that were filed, one in New York, one in California, and one eventually in Maryland as well. The decision was very controversial for a lot of reasons. There hadn't been a citizenship question on the census questionnaire for many decades. And part of the reason why that was the case is that there was generally a belief in the Census Bureau that a citizenship question would depress response rates among non-citizen households that have at least one non-citizen existing in them. And in fact, what we found out later through the litigation, through our discovery requests and through our depositions, was that the Census Bureau had continued to make that finding throughout the process, the decision-making process in the Department of Commerce. And throughout, this was information that was in front of Secretary Ross when he was making his decision, that in fact, the Census Bureau believed that response rates would decrease for non-citizen households and specifically for Hispanics across the country. And that ultimately a decrease in response rates would have a negative impact on the overall accuracy of the census. This was a really hard fought litigation over the course of about 16 months. There were great decisions at the district court level in Maryland, California, and in New York. Typically, you don't see litigation that started in March 2018 and in the Supreme Court in June 2019, but that's just the character of this litigation because of the timing issue. There was a lot of rush to get this to a resolution. Ultimately, the resolution of the case was that the Supreme Court found, in fact, that the citizenship question, the decision to add the citizenship question, was arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act. And specifically, the reasoning there was that the Secretary of Commerce, relying on some purported statements from the Department of Justice, had said that this information was necessary to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. But all of the evidence that came out in discovery really pointed to the fact that this was not, in fact, the reason why the administration was trying to impose this question on the census questionnaire. And the Supreme Court agreed ultimately and said that, in fact, the justification was contrived and reversed the decision. That's only part of the story, to be honest. That decision came down in July 2019. Here we are on Census Day, and there still is a lot of confusion out there about whether or not this question is on the questionnaire. I mentioned the hotlines that we're running at Lawyers Committee and other organizations are running as well. A large portion of the calls we're getting on this hotline are people calling to ask whether there's a citizenship question on the census questionnaire. I think there can be more done at the federal government level to sort of clear up this confusion. But I also think that as we will get into a little bit later, some of the disruption to the outreach efforts that we've been experiencing because of the COVID-19 pandemic is making it harder to reach out to communities to tell them that you can trust the census and that this, clarify this particular issue, that there is no citizenship question on the questionnaire.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So Jonathan, while the pandemic and the chilling effect of the citizenship question all proved to be a challenge in securing a full count on the census, they also build on existing roadblocks for hard to count communities who have historically been left out. Could you tell us exactly who we are talking about when we say hard to count communities, and what have been these challenges in getting them counted?
Yeah, so I'm gonna do kind of a balancing act in terms of expressing some optimism in terms of how the count is going so far. And so we can include a link for the audience to kind of take a look at the Census Hard to Count map that shows live response rates of how the country is doing, how your specific county is doing, how your specific census tract is actually doing on this current census. I'm optimistic in terms of how folks are doing. I described the folks that have filled out the census already as the low hanging fruit, right? If anybody has ever done voter engagement, these are your 4s and 5s that are absolutely going to vote. They're going to participate. You don't have to do a ton of outreach. They're already going to participate in the census. Coming into it, we anticipated that the populations that were going to be the hardest to reach were among those folks that were limited English proficient, folks that had a digital divide, not just in terms of access and broadband internet connection, but also just the digital literacy to navigate the website, to actually get to the website, to find your code, to fill it out. So there was a digital literacy barrier. We also anticipated the chilling effect that we've already talked about in terms of folks that didn't trust the institutions that were actually conducting the census, whether or not that information would be shared with law enforcement. And then the last piece of it was folks not knowing the actual logistics of who gets counted in your household. So we saw that the largest demographic of folks that weren't counted in 2010 were young children, and particularly young children within immigrant households. And in LA County, for example, the largest demographic by far was Latino children that weren't counted in the household. So there was a ton of education that really needed to take place heading into the 2020 census. I think the pandemic, unfortunately, kind of hits at the core of what we were hoping as one of our key tools in terms of educating community members, which was via direct relationships and door-to-door canvassing, and actually building the relationship with residents, not just as a one-off thing, but really looking at organizations that had the built-in trust with community members, meeting them at the places where they are usually at, whether it's at health clinics, whether it's at local markets, just being where they were at. And so I think those challenges kind of are new in the pandemic, and organizations across the state are kind of adjusting to this new landscape. So we can talk a little bit about that as we move on. But I think in looking at the hard to count population, I think the key is just recognizing that there's multiple layers of barriers that exist. And so that as you tackle one layer, there's always another layer that you have to get through. So the inertia and trying to overcome a lot of those barriers is an ongoing challenge. It's not just a one-off solution that can be fixed, right? That it requires multiple points of contact. It requires trusted messengers. It requires multiple tactics to be able to break through to reach those communities. And now folks are trying to innovate to get through that.
Great. A follow-up question from that, and you briefly mentioned it. Los Angeles has a large hard-to-count population. Other large metropolitan communities do, like New York. You see varying investments from local governments and states that house these hard-to-count communities. And then there's some states that don't make the investment. Can you talk a little bit more, Jonathan, about the roles states and local governments have played in the 2020 census?
Yeah, I think actually Beth and the Leadership Conference actually has played a really critical role in actually helping align states across the board throughout the country, because you're right in describing the effect of different localities being engaged, different states being engaged at varying levels, right? So I think early in the planning and the development of the census strategies coming into it was, how do you motivate your state to participate and engage in that process? What we're seeing now in terms of the engagement and the self-response rate, I think it requires a level of local engagement that, for populations that don't trust institutions like the federal government, and unfortunately with this administration, that's actually deterring folks from participating. The local voice, the local emphasis has been absolutely primary in all of the conversations that folks have been having. It was true in all of the message testing that we had done, a bunch of organizations had done coming into the census, was that it was critical to have your local voice as engaged in that process. I think for state governments, it's actually really fascinating in terms of the coordination between localities has been really critical in California, right? So making sure Santa Clara County is talking to LA County, is talking to Fresno County, and making sure that the different elements in each of these localities are communicating with each other, so that you don't have conflicting messages, because census is really complicated. And if one county is saying one thing, uncle's gonna share it with auntie, auntie's gonna share it with my mom, and then now we have all sorts of information that's out there that may or may not be accurate, right? So a big part of it is the coordination of making sure that folks are aligning from messaging standpoint. And the two is getting to a place where we're actually deploying resources to reach the hardest to count populations. I think for states that may not be as well resourced, just doing the baseline education around census has been a big leap, and kudos to them. The states that have really invested then are able to get to the next level of how do you do the concentrated and targeted outreach to the hard to count populations. And so I think that's been really critical. We're really spoiled in the state of California just because we have a governor that's super engaged on the process. So he's not just letting the state just kind of handle and run with it, but really engaged with bringing folks to the table to engage on census. And that work happened from 2018 all through 19, and as it's rolling out now. And so we've been pretty spoiled with that. And then the other layer of it, we're also spoiled with really, really engaged counties LA, Santa Clara are kind of the prime examples of how thoroughly engaged those counties are. And I say engaged, what I mean by that is that they are working in partnership with community-based organizations, that it's not just LA County doing whatever the hell LA County does, but they're actually working and embedded with community-based organizations to target their messaging and work alongside CBOs.
Great, thank you. Beth, I would love your take on this. So California, it sounds like, has made incredible investments, as has local municipalities. However, there's 24 states that chose not to invest at least state funding to get a proper count. Texas being one of them. Texas also being a state that could pick up an extra seat in the House of Representatives. What are you seeing as the pushback for states like Texas, and how are grassroots organizations, community-based organizations in these states trying to calibrate for that?
Yeah, absolutely. When we approached the 2020 census, we knew that this was going to be a difficult enumeration that was challenged further by the addition of the citizenship, or the attempt to add the citizenship question, which was not successful, obviously, but the specter of it still remains. We knew that distrust in government among those communities that are historically missed is really historically high. And we knew that other barriers, systemic barriers that had existed in previous censuses are certainly going to come to play for these communities. And so while federal funding goes to fund the operations of the Census Bureau, there is no outreach that is federally funded to support outreach to hard to count community groups. So a huge kudos to private philanthropy, which has stepped up in a huge way to help support and overcome some of the challenges, but we can't do it without state investment, and really a state investment in the future of their state and their population and their communities, but also investment in making sure that the federal resources and the data that they have statewide is accurate, that the distribution of resources and political power is fair, and frankly, for cities, counties across the country, it's making sure that they don't lose out on millions of dollars over the course of the next decade by not allocating funding to support outreach to hard to count communities. So to your example, the Census Counts campaign, which are the groups that are part of our campaign effort at the national level and at the state-based level, are the organizations that are representing and are a part of these hard to reach communities. They've been there before census, will be there after the census, and those are those trusted messengers that know what are the concerns that specific communities have, how do we address those. It looks different for a tribal community, it looks different for the Black community in inner city versus a rural community, looks different for Latinx community in California versus in the Rio Grande Valley. So outreach needs to be targeted, culturally competent, and research-based. When you look at a state like Texas that did not allocate statewide funding and resources to support census effort, the local community groups on the ground have really stepped up in a humongous way, working with city governments, Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, and really could go on, set up early and planned and worked with their local partners to set up complete count committees, allocate funding where it was possible, and work with local funders and private philanthropy to do what the state was not doing. Our partner, the Center for Public Policy Priorities in Texas, has been supporting statewide efforts to mobilize, engage, and really step in where the state had not. And that's unfortunate, but we know how important it is, because if folks aren't counted, we really miss out on those resources and that political power in the future. And then it looks a little bit different in different places. One thing I also mentioned, Jonathan mentioned the need to support training, and the census is technical and it's not top of mind for everyone because it happens every 10 years. The Census Counts campaign and our partners like Mileo Educational Fund and others have been doing Train the Trainers. We did one in upstate New York with the city of Syracuse to train advocates and census ambassadors about the ins and outs of census, how it works, to really empower them to go out into the community. We did one in El Paso that was half in Spanish, half in English to educate communities so that they can go out into the field. And that's particularly necessary when there aren't local resources dedicated to that outreach, but across the board, that's something that we're seeing is really making a difference in this moment.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind our audience members, we're going to be turning to your questions shortly. Please use the chat box to pose your question. And with that, we'll shift our conversation on how the pandemic has impacted the census. This is certainly something that has caused a lot of people in the civic engagement space a lot of grief in trying to retool their strategy in a very, very short amount of time. And there's a lot of uncertainty still of how this will all play out in the coming months. So I want to follow up with Beth. The Census Bureau has been making changes to its timelines in response to the COVID pandemic. What do these changes look like?
Yeah, so just to ground us, this pandemic, this public health crisis, where it's unprecedented, we're in uncertain times. And as communities stay apart to keep our communities safe, we know that emergency services, healthcare resources, and infrastructure are going to be critical to help folks get back on our feet where we can come back together. And in order to get that to folks, that all comes down to census data. And whether it's FEMA response, whether it's health investment with federal funding, all of that is driven by census data. So we can't talk about a response to this public health crisis without talking about the importance of ensuring that our data is correct, ensuring that communities aren't missed in the census. And yes, it's going to be a little harder, and we're having to be creative about how we reach folks. A couple of things, we're seeing in the outreach space is that we're obviously shifting to digital. We're having digital conversations like this all across the country today. We have a list of events on our site at censuscounts.org/events, so you can see all the different activities happening across the country. Folks are shifting to digital outreach. It was Black Census Week last week, and they changed everything from what was going to be in person to be online. And so there's really nimble adjustments happening to reach the communities that are at risk, but we know we're going to have to do more. The Census Bureau over the weekend announced a further extension of their enumeration period, or a suspension of their field operation, rather, for an additional 2 weeks, meaning they are stopping field canvassing for a universe that gets hand-delivered packets. It's about over 5 million households, particularly in rural areas that rely on P.O. boxes, particularly in Indian country. They are stopping the distribution of those hand-delivered packets out of a concern for folks' safety. They're also stopping and suspending the onboarding and fingerprinting of new staff that would be those enumerators that would have gone into the field in May. And that suspension is at this point at least until April 15th. Likely it will be extended again, given the recommendation from the White House that we have social distancing until the end of April. We're monitoring that. There's a lot of things moving in live time. We know that in addition to those two operations counting people experiencing homelessness, counting people who are in group quarters. So many of the Harvard community knows that you were asked to go home. Those students who were living in dorms are still counted as a part of that group quarters operation. So it's important that people know that you're counted where you live and sleep most of the time. So where you would have been on April 1 had this adjustment not had to happen. But we know that there are a lot of shifts like that happening. We're trying to get folks updated as quick as possible. And I anticipate that things will still be in flux in the next couple of days and weeks as we respond to this public health crisis in real time.
Thank you. Ajay, according to the federal law mandate, the Census Bureau must report apportionment count as soon as December 31st. However, former Census Bureau Director John Thompson commented that due to the severe delays caused by COVID outbreak, the Census Bureau may have to ask Congress to change federal law and extend that deadline. From a legal standpoint, what options does the Census Bureau have if the pandemic proves to severely impact participation?
So from a legal standpoint, the options the Census Bureau has is, I mean, I think, as you mentioned, the deadline is the major obstacle for the Census Bureau. It is required by federal law to provide state level counts to the president for apportionment purposes by December 31st of this year. We know that between the sort of end of the census, which was previously scheduled for July 31st and is now scheduled for August 14th, Beth, correct me if I'm wrong on that. There's a lot of sort of quality control measures that the Census Bureau has to take in between. So, there is a lot that goes on in between then. And so what that means is it's exceedingly difficult to sort of say that the Census Bureau can extend its operations further and further into the months of September and October, and then also ensure that the count that it's providing by December 31st is as accurate as it needs to be, as it should be. So, that sort of puts a little bit of a limitation on what the Census Bureau can do from a practical perspective. The other thing I would just note is, there is a conversation that happens every 10 years about whether the Census Bureau can statistically adjust its figures to account for undercounting, especially if there's a sort of failed census. One thing to note about that is, first and foremost, that the Census Bureau is unable to, from a legal perspective, adjust figures for apportionment. What that means is the figures that are provided to the different states that determine the number of Congress persons that are given to each state, that has to be done with an actual head count. There's no sampling that's allowed for that particular purpose. For the other purposes that the Census Bureau has, such as the census has, such as redistricting or providing federal funds to the state, distributing federal funds out, those figures can be statistically adjusted. That said, it's very difficult to do that. And in order to do that, the Census Bureau needs to conduct what's called its post-enumeration survey. I won't get too deep into the weeds about what this is and how it works, but suffice it to say that there have been multiple attempts to try to use the post-enumeration survey in 1980, 1990, 2000 to adjust the Census Bureau to adjust the census count to account for these undercounts. And every single time those efforts have failed, either because the Census Bureau felt like those adjusted counts weren't accurate enough, or because litigation that attempted to try to push those adjusted counts failed, because the Census Bureau has a lot of discretion in how it does these things. So that's just a long-winded way of saying that the options here are somewhat limited. And what that means is that we really need to be putting all our efforts right now into making sure that this count is as accurate as it can be right now.
Great, thank you. I didn't know about about how you could essentially calibrate the numbers for demographic purposes, it sounds like, in redistricting. That's new to me. This next question is for everyone. How are the grassroots organizations, state and local governments changing their outreach strategy in light of COVID-19? I know we touched on some of that, but I would like to go deeper into the conversation, especially when face-to-face contact is not feasible due to social distancing. Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I can go first. And one thing, thank you, Jay. I mean, I feel like that was a really helpful understanding of how this data is used and kind of the consequences of these continual delays. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to make sure that everyone knows is that I mentioned some of those operational shifts and delays and extensions that we're seeing right now. And yes, the enumeration period is extended until August 14th at this point. That's likely going to go back further because of the additional 2-week delay that we saw happen on Saturday. But it's important for folks to know that you can still respond online, by phone, by returning that paper questionnaire right now during this crisis. And we're trying to get that word out to folks as much and far as wide as possible. Our message from the Census Counts campaign and from grassroots advocates across the country has not changed. We were always looking to use the self-response period, which is what census nerds call it, but really the period before those enumerators go out door to door to encourage folks to self-identify. The reason is that the data is more accurate. You have an opportunity to identify your own household, identify your own racial and ethnic background, give your own information, and it's more accurate when it comes in. The second is that, and Jonathan mentioned this earlier, we knew that communities were scared coming into this census regardless of where we are now, but there was a historic fear of government, and folks don't want government officials coming into their neighborhood asking questions. And so the best thing you can do to prevent that from happening is to self-respond. Now that's even more important. So for our public health, and it's even more important that you respond if you are able, if you have the ability to do that at home, by phone, by returning that paper questionnaire, so that we can reduce the load in that door-to-door enumeration period. So our message really hasn't changed. We're really focused on educating people about self-response. Tactics have. So I mentioned that online we're shifting to this digital posture. I'll say, and I'm sure others can mention kind of what this means and the consequences for organizations. We're having conversations with folks who aren't digital first organizations. So, I mentioned Black Census Week. I have to do a huge shout out to the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation that had a whole in-person engagement and really shifted in days to complete online events, doing Twitter town halls and outreach and live streamed events and engaging folks where they were. We had our Facebook Census weekend this past weekend, led by Faith in Public Life. Those leaders were getting messages to faith leaders who are now communing with their congregations online via live streams. So it's a really different environment right now. It doesn't mean we can't reach people. Our campaign, we're looking at, okay, where are people going to gather? And so thinking about putting up ads in grocery stores. So as folks are going into the store, if they haven't seen that census message, that they're able to see that. We do still know we're going to have barriers. The folks who aren't covered in that, who needed some in-person engagement or needed language support that's not covered under the Census Bureau's language program, we're still going to have to figure out a way to reach those folks. For folks who are confused about the changes to operations, we're still having Train the Trainers. So we have one tomorrow, a nationwide ultimate Train the Trainer, to educate folks about some of these operational shifts because it's confusing. So we're going to have a lot of additional challenges to overcome, but we're really making those pivots right now. And I just have to say, I mean, the coalition and all of our partners really inspire me of, we can get through this and the resilience of this movement.
Great. Jonathan or Jay, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick. So a couple things. I think from philanthropy in general as a field, one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of weeks, and this is also true for the endowment, was making sure that organizations that were doing outreach have the flexibility within their grants to be able to execute all of that, right? So whatever grant outcomes, expectations, whatever reporting mechanisms, what I've seen across the field has been a relaxing of some of those processes to be able to allow organizations to adapt accordingly. Like the last thing we need is a foundation breathing down people's necks to make sure that they're hitting their numbers for census outreach. Like that's the last thing we could possibly want. It's just an acknowledgement of where folks are at, just dealing with all the multiple crises that they're handling, right? Helping their clients access healthcare, helping folks that are dealing with unemployment, right? Just across the spectrum. The same organizations that doing the bulk of the outreach on census are also handling a lot on their plate in terms of helping and supporting families and communities. So it's just an acknowledgement, and I'm proud that the endowment opened up the flexibility for program managers to be able to communicate that to their grantees. This has been true across the field of philanthropy, so I think that's really critical to emphasize that for those that haven't opened up flexibility, that's like a critical tool that folks can have at their disposal to give folks the flexibility they need to be able to adapt to the challenges ahead. The other layer is just also acknowledging the unique challenge that Asian American organizations are facing as a byproduct of this pandemic. There are reports like in the Central Valley where we had Sikh American youth that were walking and canvassing before like the shelter in place things were ordinances were established. They were getting heckled at the door, right? People didn't want to talk to folks when they were going around canvassing. So just recognizing the unique challenges that exist for those organizations and those populations, it's still going to be an uphill climb as we exit or as we flatten the curve. And then the last thing I would say is that the innovation on the strategy side of it, a lot of it is built on the infrastructure of investments that have been made over the last couple of years, right? Like folks that have been able to adjust well to switch over to more digital communications have been really a byproduct of efforts to really grow out the communications infrastructure within organizations. So one of the examples is that within the Punjabi community, there's been a shift away from the door-to-door canvassing. So now folks are going all in on WhatsApp, right, as one of the primary tools to engage communities, really utilizing that as an organizing tool, trying to be innovative in those spaces. As you know, like you can't do paid advertising within WhatsApp yet. I hear there's rumblings about the ability to do that. But what folks have been able to do is infuse themselves within communities, within certain, like the large threads. And those innovative strategies are helping folks reach community members that they would have otherwise not been able to reach via door to door, right? So I think those innovative strategies are stuff folks are trying to make do for now as we get, and it helps to have the timeline extended.
Thank you. Jay, do you have anything to add of how the legal community? Okay, great. Oh yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, one thing I was just, oh, go ahead, Ajay.
No, I was just going to say, Teresa, if you could finish the question, but that's fine.
Well, if you have anything.
Well, one thing I was just going to add, and Jonathan, thank you so much for also mentioning the impact of the xenophobic and racist tone that we're seeing across the country. I also just want to note, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, which is one of the co-chairs of our census task force, has really great resources, and in this moment, really have been lifting up their stand against hatred.org website where you can really report incidents of hate in this moment. But then we're also really leading on those hotlines that Ajay and the Lawyers Committee are leading with the Arab American Institute and the Naleo Educational Fund and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, have set up where you can report issues that are coming up, but then also ask questions while folks are at home and they're not able to go to an in-person questionnaire assistance. So the work that Jay's team are doing around those hotlines has been tremendous and a really a tremendous asset.
Great, thank you for that. I'm gonna now turn over to a question from our audience. James asks, for those working to boost participation in the census, what messaging have you used that resonated particularly strongly with individuals, prompting them to take part? And this is a question for anyone.
Yeah, I can start, and others should definitely jump in. So for a couple of years, we've been doing message research about what resonates most in communities. We did kind of a global participation research as well as community specific. So a number of organizations looked at what resonates in the Black community, what resonates in the Arab American community, what resonates for rural communities, for tribal communities. So there was a lot of work to see what are those tried and true best practices. A couple of things that we know is one of the things that is most motivating is connecting census participation to the resources in the community that you can touch and feel, and really making and connecting that personal benefit. So when we talk about census participation, we want to talk about how it connects to getting your fair share of healthcare resources, how it connects to ensuring that that park is built, bike lanes, making sure that seniors have resources and for housing and for heating. And so a number of programs, and I have to shout out the Andrew Reamer and the team at George Washington, who did an analysis of the federal programs that are driven by census funding. It's $1.5 trillion, Teresa, as you said at the top. And so we have a lot to lift up there. A couple of other things, we know that people are really concerned or have questions about government and about how their data is used. So wherever we can, we want to lift up the importance and the fact that census data is protected. It's protected by federal law. Your personal information is not shared, and it's protected for 72 years under the Census Act. And the penalties for sharing that information for Census Bureau employees is incredibly severe. It's $250,000 fine and 5 years in prison. And we know that actually lifting up those penalties is really motivating and reassuring to communities. So we actually want to articulate that. And then the last thing is that it's easy. I mean, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the number of folks in your household. But that is helps getting over that barrier of kind of, why would I take time to do this? It's not that much time.
Does anyone have anything more to add?
I would ditto the ease, the messaging around the ease of completing the census. Well, we did a ton of paid ads here in California, 10 minutes for the next 10 years, right? And that really resonated as an effective message. Message testing around census is my jam. So we have like a ton of reports that we could share afterwards. I think the key that from all of the message testing, a couple things that stood out was you have to be unique in terms of outreach into specific populations, right? So one size fit all message is not going to work. So you have to be targeted about your outreach. So appreciate the efforts across the board to utilize ethnic media to really go to the trusted messengers in those spaces. A general message from like the federal government is cute, but it doesn't resonate with the hard to count populations. And then the other piece of it is localized, right? That it's saying that filling out the census will bring X millions of dollars for your state gives no concept for folks to really understand how the census impacts people on a day-to-day basis. And really emphasizing how the census affects a person's day-to-day, how it affects their family's day-to-day lives was the thing that resonated. So when we talk about the resource aspect of it, like talk about it in terms that folks can ascribe to and make it tangible for them, that not just calling out funding for schools, but literally calling out the elementary school in their neighborhood that's going to benefit because the first 5 programs going to have more funding. All right. Being very specific locally about where those resources go. And the last piece is actually an aspirational message. It's not just a duty to participate. Like all of the stuff around duty was like relatively lower on all our messaging scale, but what you envision for your communities moving forward, the hopefulness of completing the census, I think is something that is an opportunity for us kind of in this pandemic as well. Like, what do we hope coming out of this pandemic for our communities? And what do we envision for that? And how does census play a role in that concept was something that folks really enjoyed and was a motivator in participating.
Great, thank you. So we are right against the hour mark. I think we have time for one more audience question. This next question is from John. What do you believe can be done to improve the operations to count people experiencing homelessness given to COVID-19? Does anyone want to take it?
Well, I can start, and Jonathan, I know there's a lot going on in California right now on this account too, but it's hard because so many things are in flux. The major operations counting people experiencing homelessness include service-based enumeration and then enumeration of people experiencing homelessness outdoors. That operation usually would have taken place this week. So the last couple of days of March, April 1, going into these next couple of 24 hours. That at this point was moved to the end of May and likely will be pushed again. We obviously, people experiencing homelessness and the service providers that serve those communities are very impacted by this crisis. And so I think what we can do is listen to what those service providers that know their clients the best need in order to keep their doors open and provide the services that the communities need, but then also to reach those people experiencing homelessness. It's definitely something that's really top of mind in this moment. And I think what is going to be helpful on our end is getting transparency from the Census Bureau about how those operations are shifting so we can do that education and strategy. And then again, listening to the service providers and the folks who work and are living alongside of people experiencing homelessness to understand how do we shift our outreach to best serve those folks.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything more to add to that? Great. So how about we move to the last word? We have about a minute left. This is for everyone. How can our audience members help in reaching a full count on the census, and what resources do you recommend for them?
Yeah, so one, educate yourself about the census. You can go to censuscounts.org, and we've got tons of resources for your organizing, for your outreach there. But today, it's Census Day, and we want everybody to know about the importance of the census and that they can be counted. So participate in our census challenge. So today, we're asking folks to post and tag 3 people that you count on in your life. Talk about the importance of the census, hopefully say that you participated in the census, and then encourage them to do that. Post that on Twitter or on Instagram or on Facebook, and then pass it on and pass on the word about the importance of census participation. And we're using hashtag census challenge for that.
Great. Jonathan, yeah.
So agree with everything that Beth just said. Also would just want to lift up again the hotlines that our organization's running, as well as NALEO, Asians American Advancing Justice, the Arab American Institute. I will make sure that those are circulated after this call. Definitely, publicize those, make those, let people in your networks know about those hotlines. And if anyone is experiencing any issues filling out their census, or as we move into the NRFU stage, whatever that looks like, the non-response follow-up stage, whatever that looks like, if people are running into issues, call those hotlines, report those issues. It's a great way for us to get to know exactly what the problems are and see if we can get a rapid response to address those issues.
Great.
Ditto the last 2 questions, and then continue. My reco would that if folks have the resources to donate, contribute to organizations that are at the front lines of really doing the census work. Like Beth mentioned, a lot of the homelessness advocacy organizations are really struggling right now to be able to adjust accordingly to the new pandemic. So whatever support that you all can give in that regard, and then continue to highlight the organizations that are doing the good work, because at the end of the day, our success is going to be entirely dependent on their ability to execute and our ability to support them in that work. So if you can, continue to support those orgs.
Great. Well, with that, we'll wrap up. I want to thank our panel for a timely and engaging discussion on the census and how we can all work together in encouraging our communities to be counted. Again, this talk will be posted on the Ash Center website and the Harvard Votes Challenge website. You can also find more information about the census under the Be Counted tab on the Harvard Votes Challenge page. And we will make sure to link all of the resources that were mentioned by our panelists in the video description. I invite you to please join us for future conversations around the critical democracy work ahead of us as we also deal with the challenges posed by COVID-19. And make sure to check out the ASH events page for the future events. You can also follow us at Harvard ASH. And last, I would like to thank you, the audience, for bringing in engaging questions for our discussion. And till next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye. Thanks again.